Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And today I'm going to take a look at the work of Peter Tate, an obscure science fiction writer who was active in SF writing between 1966 and 1979. He's a figure who has long been on the peripheries, who never really showed any chance of breaking through big time, but he's nonetheless very interesting. And I'm going to discuss his work and his career, or what I can discover about it here today, because it's very, very hard to find out anything about this writer at all. Peter Tate was a Welshman, like me. He lived in the Cardiff area for most of the period that he was active as an SF writer, though in the mid-1970s he seemed to move to Dorset. He worked on the South Wales Echo, a newspaper in Cardiff, so he was a journalist. And when he moved to Dorset, it looks as if it was partially a career move, because he worked on a newspaper which I think was situated in Bournemouth at that time. And I say he was born in 1940. We think he's still alive. We don't know. If anybody has any information about Peter Tate, please get in touch, because I'd love to know. His first story was published in New Worlds in 1966 in the classic New Wave era. And that was entitled The Postmortem People, and that was later published in SF12 by Judith Merrill under an alternative title, which I'll pop up on the screen. He was very interested in environmentalism and politics, and these are the two main threads of his science fiction work. He wrote 7 books, 6 novels, and 1 collection of short stories. The strange thing about this is, being a Welsh science fiction writer, a British science fiction writer, you would expect that the predominance of his published work would appear in the UK. With Peter Tate, it's the opposite. Most of it appeared in the US, and only in the US. Really, only one of his books was ever issued in paperback as well, which makes him even stranger. And that's his debut novel, The Thinking Seat. And here's The Thinking Seat, which I haven't read yet. And this was published in, let's see, 1969. It's copyrighted in 1967, but it's 1969. And there was also a hardcover edition from Faber in the UK as well. So this was the only paperback ever published by Peter Tate. If you find anything else and I'm wrong, again, do let me know, because I'd love to know. And this is the first in a sequence of 3 novels. And this sequence are the ones I haven't read. I've read all the others. And The Thinking Seat is set in the near future. In fact, it's set in 1973. And as I say, this was published late 60s in California. And it was about a desalination plant being built on the shoreline to take water out of the sea, to desalinate it so it could be used inland. And there actually was a desalination plant planned to be built at that point, as Tate points out in an afterword or forward in this. And of course that alters the salt level in the sea and has effects on the wildlife. And you get the impression, just in looking at this, as I say, I haven't read it yet, this is probably quite a sort of proto-hippie book, in a way that there is a central character who's a kind of charismatic guru called Simeon, and he has a female disciple, and they arrive in the town where the salination plant has been built, and they began to sort of preach against man's subjugation of nature and the environmental impact. And I'll say I'm yet to read this one. I've just read 3 books by Tate in a row, so I wanted to take a bit of a break from him, because even though he's interesting, he's not front rank, I will say that. But if you like unusual SF and you've got a particular bent for literary SF which didn't quite come through, this is well worth a read. So as I say, interestingly, this is the only one ever published in paperback, and it was issued by Curtis Books, who I'll admit I don't know a great deal about. So there it is. So if you see it, pick it up. His work is reasonably uncommon. Some of it is quite pricey, but generally speaking, you can pick it up without too much expense, though you are going to be looking at ABE and eBay, because you very rarely see these in the wild. So that's The Thinking Seat. Interestingly, the second book in this series, which is called Moon in an Iron Meadow, is actually set in a fictional locale created by Ray Bradbury. Now, if you've read Ray Bradbury, and I'm a massive Bradbury fan, you may well have read Dandelion Wine, which is personally my favourite novel by him. What I would say about Dandelion Wine is it's not an SF novel. It doesn't really have any fantastic aspects. It's just about the imagination of a young boy going through his last summer before he becomes a man. He's going through adolescence. It's a very beautiful lyrical pastoral book. So the town in this, Greentown, Illinois, is the setting for the second book in Tate's series, which is really interesting. Moon in an Iron Meadow focuses on bioweapons particularly, and this is something that Tate would return to again later in his career. There were several sort of quasi sequels to this. I would say Something Wicked This Way Comes, I think, is set in Greentown as well, and is similar because it's about children's imaginations more than anything else. And there's also a much later sequel called Farewell Summer, which really isn't much cop at all, I didn't think. But then again, I think once Bradbury got beyond the 70s, he was just recycling and repeating the same old things, even though the writing was as beautiful as ever. The power just wasn't there. So watch out for Moon and Iron Meadow. The third and final book in the sequence was called Faces in the Flames, the fourth in a series of small wars. That was the subtitle. And that seems to be one of the more common ones, and that may be one I'll pick up again soon. For those of you who like an austere cover, and you know me, I like an austere cover as well, this is my Hart Davis hardcover edition of Dandelion Wine, which is like a 70s reissue, which I've had for a very long time. Look at that. It doesn't come much more beautiful than that. Nice and simple. So returning to Tate's strange publication career as such, as I say, 7 books, 6 novels, 1 collection, only one of the books ever issued in paperback, and that one in the USA. There was no UK equivalent. Only 2 books were published in the UK, and they were the original Faber hardcover edition of The Thinking Seat, which I'll flash up on the screen in a moment, and also his second novel, which was published in, let's just see, 1971, and this was published before the second and third books in the Simeon sequence, and this is Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is a lengthy review of this in my members area, what I call the club room. Membership is $4.99 a month for an exclusive video every week. There's a backlist of about 50, and you can join and see the review there, but I will come back to that in a moment. So only 2 books published in the UK, both by Faber, who published quite a bit of SF then. They were doing people like Chris Priest, they later did Gary Kilworth, Christopher Evans. They were also publishing international figures like Harry Harrison and Roger Zelazny as well. And as I say, there is a review of that in the club room. Just to cover it briefly, it's a very interesting book. It is a near future SF book. It's set in Tuscany in Italy, and really it's about the story of one man who is made a scapegoat for the collective guilt of the world, or the collective guilt the world feels. And it's also a kind of inverse zone novel, because it takes place in these 5 walled gardens, Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's very strange indeed. If you see it, pick it up. This is one of the more collectible ones because it's Faber and because of its small underground reputation, but it is really interesting. Not quite my favourite of his books, but it came really close, and I enjoyed reading it, despite the fact it's occasionally a very befuddling work. After that 1 US paperback and 2 hardcover Faber books, basically Tate's career seemed to be curated by Doubleday in the US, and Doubleday of course did lots and lots of SF in hardcover, and a lot of it was book club editions, and they issued a heck of a lot, and it varied enormously in quality, though there were some real classic things in there. And here are 2 of Tate's Doubleday books, which, as I say, were never published in the UK. And what's fascinating about this is that they are books which are probably a lot more accessible now and then to UK readers, because they're largely set in the UK. This is Seagulls Under Glass and Other Stories by Peter Tate. Very, very handsome, I think you'll agree. And this collects 12 stories, 8 of which were published in different SF magazines. And just to take you through it, there's 4 originals in here as well. And this is a review copy. Look at that. So there we go. And it says March the 28th, 1975. So that went out to a newspaper or magazine in the States and was probably never ever reviewed. It's a beautiful first edition. So yeah, just to take you through where the stories were published, they were published in places like New Worlds. There are 3 from New Worlds, Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Galaxy magazine, which is exactly where I'd expect these literary near future type stories to be set. Also one from an anthology called Alchemy and Academe, which was edited by Anne McCaffrey, and also one from Fantastic. And as I say, there are 4 originals in here. You can also pick this up as well. I haven't read all of this yet. Very interesting stuff. If you're interested in New Wave, I would say that's one to go for. But was Peter Tate really New Wave, despite really being most consistently published in Britain in New Worlds magazine? Well, not essentially in terms of his style, even though he's very elliptical, illusory, doesn't get to the point, beats around the bush a lot, and a lot of the time you are wondering about, is he actually going to lay clearer what he's talking about? Is he going to put some meat on the bones of the hints of extrapolation? But he does an infodump, and in that way, was he ahead of his time, or was it just ineptitude? Well, of course, the strangest thing of all is that he was a journalist. Journalists, of course, are very good at taking little snippets of information, putting them together and gradually building a story out of them, and sometimes finding the truth. I get the impression that very often Tate had lots of little ideas which he would list together and try and build a story around them. And I know I've done that myself in my writing. So it is quite interesting. But from a journalist, one expects a very strong narrative sense, very definite, well put together, parquet flooring, sort of pattern of things coming together where all the dovetails fit into the slots and all the joinery is immaculate. And that doesn't happen in Tate. He's a bit subtler than that. And I can't really tell whether it's down to a combination of style and subtlety, or whether really he just needed a good editor. Something he says in one of the forewords in one of the stories in this is the first thing you should do in writing is try and express yourself. And I'm not entirely sure that's a really good idea for a novice writer. I think you should try and get the bare bones first and then add that later on, bring the character to it later on. And I think really that's where he fell down. With the Doubleday thing in mind, I just get the feeling that an editor never touched these books, apart from changing spellings. Like, for example, in one of them, somebody talks about a cancelled check, a means of payment, and the word check is spelt in the American way, C-H-E-C-K, rather than the British way, C-H-E-Q-U-E. So there's that. But other than that, you get the feeling that editorial hands never touched the books at all, especially the novels, which is quite interesting. My favourite of the novels that I've read so far is one I have covered on the channel before. It was quite some time ago, but because I was revisiting his work in more depth, I decided to include it in this video. And that's Country Love and Poison Rain, which I'm just going to show you now. Very beautiful, I think you'll agree. And I read this a couple of years ago, and this had a particular meaning to me because it is described, or was described, in an earlier edition of the Science Fiction Encyclopedia by Clute Nichols as possibly the only SF novel about Welsh nationalism. And I'm naturally interested in Welsh nationalism, being a Welsh expatriate. Although published in 1973, Country Love and Poison Rain was set in 1975, only 2 years hence, as it were, from that point. And it concerns a plot where the US military forces under the aegis of NATO decide to stash a cache of nerve gas, sarin nerve gas. You can look sarin up. It's pretty scary stuff. Under some hills in the Brecon Beacons in South Wales. And a number of characters get together to try and thwart this. So there are a ragtag group of characters in this. Welsh nationalist groups, a folk singer who's connected to them, a journalist who's investigating it all. There's a US Vietnam draft dodger who's come to the UK because he shared something about this. There's a student involved, and it all takes place around Cardiff, Caerphilly and the Brecon Beacons. They're all areas I know really well, in areas I grew up in. And of course, because I was in those parts of the world in the 70s, particularly Cardiff and Caerphilly, which was just over the mountain from where I lived, and I had lots of relatives there, I found this really, really interesting. And it is a really, really good near future thriller type story, and it would have made a good TV series. So there you go. Maybe that never happened. It's one of those things that never happened. It should have. But it was never published in the UK, and strangely, no Welsh small press has issued this either. So if there's any Welsh small presses out there, try and get hold of the copyright and publish it, because I think it would be a really interesting little curio, and boy would I love to write the foreword for it. Tate's style is sometimes a bit stiff and stumbling, and the language he uses often gets in the way of him unfolding the story. So he can be a frustrating read as well as a fascinating one, and I found that even in the best of his works I've read, which is Country Love and Poison Rain. But you shouldn't let that stop you from looking into that or Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, because as strange as they are, they're also quite original. Seagulls Under Glass came out in the mid-70s and was pretty much the swan song apart from his last book, Greencomber. And Seagulls Under Glass contains a short story which has the seeds of Greencomber, his last novel, in it. And it actually is quite revelatory, because even though it's a little bit of a tryout for what he does in Greencomber, the last novel, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth in a moment, there's a very interesting little foreword to that story in here, in which Tate writes about where he lives, which is near a park south of where I came from in Wales, and how he would go for a walk every morning, and in the park he would just think, why do people leave litter? There's litter everywhere. And he got the idea of, you know, if he was on a beach, he'd be a beachcomber, but what would he be if he was on grass? He'd be a greencomber, and that's where the title of Greencomber came from. Also, he talked about a castle which was north of him, which was literally about 2 to 3 miles from where I grew up, and that's called Castell Coch, which means Red Castle. And it was basically a 19th century folly. There was a castle there at one point, but it was a crumbled ruin, and it was rebuilt for the Marquis of Bute, who was a very rich sort of coal mining owning character from South Wales. And he had it designed on the interior by a guy called William Burgess, who was a key figure in the arts and crafts movement. He was kind of a William Morris light, as it were. There is a video of me visiting Castell Coch on the channel from a few years back, so I'll pop a link in at the end. But Tate said it was these two things, the greencomber coming along out of nowhere, that word coming out of nowhere, and litter and environmental devastation, connected to the image of this castle which was outside Wales. And he said that as a boy he went to see an Alan Ladd film in the cinema in Cardiff, which was obviously made in Hollywood, but there were shots of Castell Coch in it. So those two things came together in his mind. So this is a classic example of an author drawing on what's around him. And Greencomber is really not set in Wales, it's actually set in Dorset and the New Forest and places like Ringwood, and refers to those areas a lot. So that's down to where Dorset Bob lives. As you can see, it's got this very beautiful Bradbury-esque cover, absolutely lovely, and there's the little castle up there in the hill, and that is actually quite like what Castell Coch is like. And just to show you, very beautiful book. This is a first edition. None of these books ever got reprinted, they were always just first, which shows they didn't really catch on. So you maybe get the feeling that Doubleday had slots to fill and they would just buy them and fill the slots with them. And Greencomber is a book which was published in 79. It does feel rather behind the times by that point. It does feel more like an early or mid-70s book rather than an end of the 70s book. Greencomber begins with the titular character, Greencomber, who at that point is called Beachcomber, is coming out of his chalet on the beach in the morning, like a wooden structure. And he's been eking a subsistence living from beachcombing, from finding things and recycling them. And he becomes aware that this is being overtaken by a group of people he calls bounty hunters, who have metal detectors, who wear goggles and strangely futuristic garb. And there are a number of these men sweeping across the Strand, picking up the kind of things that he would have. And Beachcomber has a small altercation with the leader of these men, who's called Manning. But Manning says that really Beachcomber is a kind of talisman. He leads them to where the good stuff is. Realizing that his days on the beach are numbered, Beachcomber moves inland into the forest and decides from now on to call himself Greencomber. We never know what his real name is, and it almost doesn't matter. And at this point, the reader is struggling to work out exactly what the milieu is. It's obviously near future. It transpires that one of the children, a little girl who's probably about 4, called Satin, is the offspring of 2 drug-damaged people, maybe from the 1960s, one who's been an acid head, the other has been taking other things, and also she has been affected by things like pesticides and pollutants in the environment, and she has been constructed in a lab, she's kind of a test tube baby, by these scientists, of whom this Germanic figure may be one, and this is all taking place in Stockholm in Sweden. All of this is very nebulous and misty, and it isn't sort of pinned down, so you're trying to work out what's going on. And I guess in a way that reflects Tate's background in journalism, where you're trying to winkle out little facts out of a cloud of information. And it can be quite frustrating, but it also brings a kind of atmosphere to the book, which is really fascinating. To cut a long story short, Greencomber liberates the children from this scientist, from the castle. He takes them off and they go on walkabout around the Dorset countryside. And he works his way inland, ends up in a village which is quite rural. And there's a moment where a strange event happens overnight where all the trees are defoliated, but there is some evidence of a deforestation, a defoliant being used in the way that they were used in Vietnam. With the scant amount of money he has, Greencomber initially rents a bungalow which is near a seafront that is collapsing due to soil erosion into the sea, and he stays there with the woman singer and the two children, Satin and Ben. And Ben seems to have had his intelligence artificially increased through some method, which is referred to more in the short story version. And even though Ben is 6, he often talks like an adult. Strange things happen. At one point, the woman, who is called Singer, is thought to be a witch and is placed on a ducking stool. And there is a kind of quasi-climax about a third of the way through the book where the element of folk horror seems to creep in. And I don't want to overemphasize this because horror is too strong a word. But people tend to have some sort of views, or they seem to think that they can interpret things which are happening, some which are down to science, in a manner which is more like folklore or superstition, and it's very, very, very strange. Halfway into the book, Greencomber starts to speculate about the strange things happening around him with the villagers and their rural beliefs, which relate back something 900 years earlier to the accidental killing, or was it an assassination, of an English king. And we start to get all this historical detail, and you begin to think, well, what is going on with this? And there's a lot of it, and a little knowledge about this part of English history would be helpful, though I admit my knowledge of this particular incident and event was absolutely nothing, and I do need to research it now because it was quite interesting. And Greencomber begins to believe that there is some sort of age-old conspiracy going on in the era relating to this assassination, or was it merely a hunting accident, that goes back all this time. And it is a really handy little red herring, and I'm not going to say where it goes, but it leads you down an interesting garden path. The second part of Greencomber is shorter, and it's almost as if what Tate was doing was writing 2 separate novellas here, which he was going to try and sell maybe to something like New Writing and SF, and it never came out, and the two got combined. And it is really odd. It's a really, really odd little book, and I can't stop thinking about it. But at the same time, it was a frustrating one as well. And the coda of the book seems to suggest the kind of circular time that you get in Keith Roberts' The Chalk Giants, which is one of my favourite experimental books from the New Wave period, but which doesn't involve New Wave techniques in terms of typography and the language used. And this is an interesting point. Something that Tate does, he uses a means of emphasis in his writing, especially in dialogue, where every now and again a word will be in capitals. And to begin with, I felt this was sort of a reference to Alfred Bester doing unusual typographical things, but it's not. It's just his way of emphasizing things. And this is where I think that maybe editors hardly looked at the book, because he does this increasingly as time goes on, and quite a lot in Greencomber. And it sort of becomes the mark of a writer who is trying to emphasize the things that maybe didn't need emphasizing, while plot points maybe needed more clarity. So it is an interesting but stiff and stumbling sort of journey that you go through when you're reading Greencomber. Have I read anything else quite like it? Not really, and that's what attracts me to it. It does seem quite, and I hate to use the word dated, but in the late 70s, this sort of book was pretty much on the way out. But I guess that's what appealed to me about it. I can't put it into a neat little box, and that alone is an interesting thing. Will I continue reading Tate? Will I read his other books? Well, I certainly have 1 or 2 of the stories left to finish, and they're very varied. So you should try and check him out. I would say if you try and pick out books by him, probably the easiest one to find in the States would be The Thinking Seat. In the UK, I would really try and get hold of Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the States, it was called Gardens 1 to 5. You might find it easier to get a cheaper US copy. Overall, though, I like this one the best. This was the first one I read. Am I sorry that I moved on to the others? Not at all, because they're really, really interesting. This one and Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are fascinating. Green Coma, despite its strangeness, has its allure as well. And Peter Tate, somebody who I feel, with a stronger editor who could have helped him mould his career more and shook him up a bit and said, stand back and let's use the journalistic thing more, could have moved forward. But as it is, he ends up as a footnote. There are so many footnotes in the history of SF, but I, for one, am glad that I've been enjoying his work, because it really has helped me get out of a bit of a reading rut. On that front, what else have I read recently? Well, let's have a look. Something I bought a week or so ago, and I must say it is quite hard going, though it does relate to SF, is Mark Fisher's Flatline Constructs, which was his dissertation for his degree. And it's subtitled Gothic Materialism and Cybernetic Theory Fiction. And of course, Flatline Constructs is from Neuromancer. And there's a lot in here about Neuromancer and David Cronenberg's Videodrome as well. And it's about postmodernism and fiction. It is really quite hard going. It would help if you'd read a lot of the philosophers who are mentioned in here. Some of them I haven't read. There are things about Ballard in here as well, mostly about Crash. So this is a deeply theoretical book. And of course, it was written to be read and peer reviewed by academics. So it's not a natural entry point for Fisher, though it was interesting. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to read some of the philosophers in here I haven't read, or I haven't read specific works. But it is quite high theory, but it goes in the science fiction reference library. I'm going to finish off with something light, and the very wonderful Bruce Harper, who's from Toronto. Why are Canadians so nice? The Canadians are such nice people, aren't they? I know I keep saying that. Sent me this Forbidden Planet card. And he said that basically when I did a video in my club room looking at some of my favourite science fiction films on Blu-ray and DVD, he spotted Forbidden Planet, or I must have talked about it. And he says, I found this card online and thought of you. Thanks to your SF Films video in the club room, I had the pleasure of enjoying Forbidden Planet last year. Well, of course, it's a wonderful film. More recently, I've also enjoyed the first two Mad Max movies. He says he's been making good progress in one of his reading goals for the year, reading 10 Hugo winners. Hugo Wiggers. That'd be a great name, wouldn't it? Hugo winners. I recently finished Stand on Zanzibar by Brunner. What a ride. For me, it was peak late 60s SF. Well, rightly so. So there you go. And he says he's going to read some ancient history to make some variety, but that's Forbidden Planet. So that's what I've been reading recently, the strange Welsh science fiction of Peter Tate. More Welsh strangeness on the channel soon with me. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment. And as I say, if you want to see some more, go into the club room, $4.99 a month. Lots to watch there. Bye for now.